Instead, I talk about kind of the lowest moments of my life. And I do this for two reasons. The lowest moments of my life deal with a lifelong struggle with depression. And I know that about 1 in 5 people struggle with depression in some way, shape, or form. And so if that's you, and if anything I say today starts to hit home with you today, the purpose is I want you to know you're not alone, and I want you to know that there is hope, and I want you to feel encouraged with what I have to say. And the other reason that I share these things is that I realize that as Christians, we're kind of terrible when it comes to dealing with brokenness and mental illness. We're really good at dealing with other types of illness, but we don't get very passing grades all the time for dealing with mental illness. So I kind of like to put myself in your firing line if that's your situation, and maybe encourage you to, as a church, to begin dealing with it a little bit differently. So I share my story, and I tell people that I've struggled with depression really as long as I can remember. You know, I know that sounds odd. People say, well, as a child, you surely didn't think that you were depressed. No, I didn't, but now that I've had the opportunity to speak with doctors and therapists and understand what depression is, I certainly realize that many of my thought patterns as a child were there, and they were of that depressive quality. So I know that it's been a lifelong thing. And I spent 16 years in full-time ministry. And all the while, I refused to get help, largely because I was in full-time ministry. And as I didn't get help, it just made it get worse and worse and worse. So what I did instead of getting help is I would try to spiritualize the problem. The first thing I would do is I would try to say, well, psychiatry isn't real. Mental illnesses aren't real. I would read some books that would say the same things, and I would think I don't need medicine or counseling, and I would try to spiritualize the thing, which looking back on, I don't really understand that approach. You know, when we run into somebody who tells us that, you know, they've been diagnosed with cancer, we don't say, well, you know, the Apostle Paul said that some people have gotten sick from taking the Lord's Supper with the wrong heart. Do you think that's what happened? We don't do that. Now, I've had people with cancer come and tell me, yeah, some people do that, but we tend to realize they're wrong. But I would tell myself, and sadly I would tell others, that emotional problems are simply a matter of the spirit, and they need to be prayed over. You need to figure out whatever sin has caused it and confront it. And I want to tell you that never did any good for me. It just gave me one more excuse not to go and get help. The other thing I would tell myself is, well, you're the pastor, and you can't be the pastor if you have some sort of problem. I don't know why I ever thought that pastors had to be perfect, but I would think that I had in my head that if the people knew that I struggled with anything, well, then I couldn't lead. I couldn't be the pastor anymore, and so I would refuse to get help. And then, of course, I would also try to compare my life to others and say, well, you haven't been through the kind of stuff other people have. And there's a young man in our lives, we call him our unofficial son. He lived with us for a year. He was never officially a foster child or adopted. It was a strange case of somebody running away from home on the church van. And that's true. And he lived with us for a year, and then he went on to the Army, and now he's doing some big things in Amway. But I would look at him, and I would think, well, he's been through, to describe his childhood it's horrific, and yet he's the happiest guy you'll ever meet. So who am I? I had good parents, and I had a good childhood. Who am I then to say that I have any sort of problems? So I'll just be fine. The problem was telling myself I will just be fine and not getting help made something happen. As I started to get older, I began to realize that my real seasons of depression were getting much more severe, and they were coming much more frequently. And it was really starting to hinder the way I did just about everything. And eventually, it got the best of me. Now, what I often tell people when I start to explain what that means is I'll tell people, well, I had to really come to terms with the fact that I have serious depression. But what that really means is that one morning, I had really come on with just a full-on breakdown. It's really hard to describe. Parts of it were everything got very hazy and cloudy in my mind. Parts of it were it took every ounce of concentration I had to go home. And I knew that I was in a very dark place, and I didn't think I was going to be able to survive where I was. I told my wife I needed help, and the only thing she could do was to take me to the emergency room. Now, as I tell stories about that emergency room, I want to explain something. I fully believe that Cox North is a great facility. I believe that the doctors and the staff there are top-notch, but they deal with a lot of different people, and they're prepared for it. So we get into this situation. We go to the emergency room, and people always ask us, well, why did you go to Cox North? Well, one, there's not too many places in town where you can go when you're having that kind of an emergency. And two, they're 4 blocks from our house. So we go there, and my wife kind of went in and she explained what was going on, and they said, yes, you just come into the emergency room. We're equipped for that. Well, we kind of realized right away this wasn't the type of emergency room visit we were used to. I mean, we have boys, so we're used to emergency room visits. Carrie, our youngest, he was our foster child in Hawaii, and then we adopted him. But he had to have stitches twice when he was our foster child. He just does everything at full speed without fear, and so we're used to emergency room visits. We realized right away this one was a little bit different because they put us in a room that was completely empty except for a little mat on the floor and this weird mirror in the corner. And I thought, oh wow, they just put us in a place where you can't hide. And they told us, they said, we'll need to put on a hospital gown. I thought, okay, that's normal. And they said, and then put all your belongings into this bag. And then they came back in to get the bag, and my wife said, oh, I can take that. And they said, no, we take it. And they left, and my wife said, I wonder why they did that. And I thought, I think that means I can't leave. Well, things were a little bit odd and different, but they eventually talked with me. Several people talked with me, and I think we all kind of came to the decision that it would be best that day if they admitted me. So they admit me, and that was a little bit different. They wheeled me up with an armed guard going with us, and I thought, well, this is different than most emergency room trips. But then they take me in this little room, and they're very nice and caring, and they're trying to assess all the situation. My blood pressure had just skyrocketed, so they were trying to deal with that, and they're very nice. But as they were trying to kind of assess me and get me ready to go into the unit, I could hear someone just screaming in the other room. And I guess it appeared that I was a little nervous, and the nurse said, are you nervous? And I said, well, I haven't had the best day. This isn't my best day. And she says, well, have you ever been in a place like this? Or maybe jail? And I thought, this is going to be like jail? I've never been to jail. By the way, after 4 days of that, I feel like I know a little bit what it's like. But that kind of startled me a little bit. But then we go in, they have me all set up. They take me into what they call the day room. And I have missed dinner, but they put some food in front of me, but I really wasn't happy. Didn't really feel like it. I just really wanted at that point just to go to sleep if I could. And I asked, we're in this room of there's probably about 24 people in there. And one guy is just screaming still. And now I get to see him. I mean, his name is Jay, and he's yelling at everybody. He's yelling at all the nurses. They're contemplating whether or not they're going to have to take care of him in some manner. He's yelling at other patients who are trying to calm him down. And he's all mad because I guess they've locked all the doors to the rooms until a certain time. And so I'm observing this, and I'm thinking, I don't really want to be here with this guy screaming. So I ask one of the orderlies, I say, do I have a room? Is there like a room I get to go to? And like, well, you can't go in there until 8 o'clock. Like, yeah, but do I have one? I'd kind of like to at least know where I'm going to go. And he goes, yeah, let me check. And he comes back and goes, oh yeah, you're in room 14 with Jay. Okay, I mean, this isn't the place to be judgmental, but, which by the way, I eventually got to know Jay, stay in that room. He was an interesting guy. He absolutely could not follow any of the rules. That was an issue every single night. The biggest one, they would let you have a pencil if you needed to write something down, but they didn't want you to keep a pencil, and so you always had to turn it back in. And he would always take it and hide it in our room somewhere. And so pretty much nightly, they would have to come and turn our room upside down until they found Jay's pencil. And I remember once he even ran out screaming at them, saying, I'm not going to stab anybody with that pencil. I've stabbed lots of people with lots of things, and I'm not stabbing anybody with that pencil. He comes walking back in. I say, you stabbed lots of people? And he said, don't worry, I'm not going to stab you. I thought, well, that's good. Me and Jay, we were making a connection. But I will tell you that when visiting day came and my wife and my mother, they came to visit me, it was a little bit of a shock. Psychiatric units pretty much look exactly like they do on TV. And they bring me in, and I'm dressed in the patient clothes, and I tell them, I'm pretty sure I am exactly where I'm supposed to be. And I tell them this for two reasons. Because one, I knew I would get the help that I needed. Because in there, of course, I tell all the funny stories. I do that to break a lot of the ice when I tell the crazy stories about being in there. But I also got to see a general physician to talk about my health, a psychiatrist to get me on the right kind of medication, and a psychologist to really help kind of sort some things out. I'll talk about that in a minute. And then before I left even, they made sure that I had all follow-up appointments, and much to the surprise of all the people that I had known throughout 16 years of ministry that would act like psychiatry was the enemy of the church, they even wanted to make sure that I was involved in a good church because they knew that kind of support would be something that was important. So for that reason, I knew I was right where I needed to be. I also knew I was right where I needed to be because in the middle of all of this, there was no way I could any longer deny that I might have a problem. It's hard to say, no, I don't have a problem with depression, when you can look back and say, well, remember when they locked you up for 4 days because of it? I kind of had to come to that point where I realized I had a problem. It's not unlike a little bit lighter problem. My wife used to tell me that I might have sleep apnea because she said I would snore. She said, your snoring is getting worse and worse and worse. And I'd always think, I don't snore. I've never heard myself snore. Anybody else been in that situation? People tell you snore, but you don't believe it because you've never heard yourself snore? I took a train trip one day. I love traveling by train. I took a long-distance train trip, and I love traveling by train, but I can't afford the sleeper cars. So I was in coach, and I drifted off to sleep one night for an overnight run, and I woke up a few minutes later to everyone in the car asking the conductor if there was an available sleeper car that I might be able to have. And the conductor said, yeah, he'd have to pay the upgrade, and someone yelled, we'll take up a collection. And I realized, yeah, maybe I do have a problem with snoring. I'm getting that taken care of too, but it was kind of at that moment I realized, okay, I can no longer say that I don't need help. And that's where That's one of the reasons why I told my mom and my wife that I was right where I needed to be in that hospital, because not only was I getting the help I needed, but I could no longer run and hide and say, I don't have a problem. Now, ironically, after years of trying to spiritualize my depression, and after years of trying to tell people that psychiatry and psychology is not really something that Christians should be a part of, some of the most godly advice came from the psychologist at the hospital. Because he told me he wanted me to start thinking about 3 questions. He told me he wanted me to test every thought, which he then pointed out, I believe that's biblical. And we had talked a little bit about how one of my biggest thoughts that was going through my head was constantly that I was a failure. Because I had come back from Hawaii, our church had barely gotten going, and then we had to close it all and come home, and I really was at a loss there. I had attempted two sales jobs and found out I am no salesman. And so I was really constantly just thinking, I am a failure. And so he told me, he said, I want you to ask yourself 3 questions every time you come up with a thought like that. He said, 1, you need to ask yourself, is it true? And I told him, I said, well, I just told you, I failed at being a church planter. I failed at being an insurance salesman. I failed at being a timeshare salesman. And he said, yeah, that's what you've done. Is it true to say you're a failure? Well, not if you put it that way. No, I guess it's not true. He said, okay. Then I want you to think, is that thought, so the second question is this thought helping you reach any of your goals? Well, no. So does telling yourself you're a failure motivate you to go out and achieve any of the things you want to in life? No, it doesn't. And he said, all right. The third question I want you to ask is it helping you feel the way you want to feel? Do you feel better telling yourself you're a failure? No. He said, well, if that thought isn't true, and it's not motivating you to your goals, and it's not helping you with the way you want to feel, then do what the Bible says and test that thought and get rid of it. And he taught me a little bit about how to kind of rephrase the thought to make it something that was true and helpful and motivating. And then he said, because he knew I had been a pastor, he said, and pastor, he said, I'm going to throw in a 4th question for you. Are these thoughts that you're constantly telling yourself true about what you know of God? And I'll admit to you that at that moment, I kind of wanted to avoid that question. Because what I have learned is in all of these depressive thoughts that we just let run wild in our heads without testing them the way the Apostle Paul said, we pull ourselves further and further from God. And at that moment in my life, having reached probably the lowest point of my life, I wasn't sure I really wanted to think about what God thought. But not long after that, I came across a verse, and it's a verse that I've seen a million times, and you have too, but it's John 10:10. And it says this, the thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. Now, that's one of those verses that you might think about for a minute, and then if you're like me, you just kind of pass on, because it just seems kind of like one of those, well, duh, Satan's bad, Jesus good, got it, I'll move on. But there's more to it than that. I begin to wonder, why does Jesus call Satan a thief? And I looked at the broader context, and the broader context was when Jesus was referring to himself as the good shepherd and his sheep hearing his voice. And so I got to thinking, okay, so we're talking about not just a thief, but a sheep thief. And I don't know a lot about sheep thieves, but I've lived in Birch Tree, but I don't remember anybody stealing sheep. I'm not saying it's not possible, So I got to thinking, why would somebody steal sheep? I tried to think of all the reasons why somebody might steal a sheep. Maybe they want lamb chops. Good rack of lamb. I once spent 7 weeks in Kazakhstan adopting our oldest child. There was a restaurant right down the street from our hotel that served lamb. Now, I'm not sure it was lamb because every time I ordered it, it looked different. So I'm guessing sometimes it wasn't lamb, but they said it was lamb, and it was good. So maybe the thief wants some lamb. Or maybe he just wants to hurt the shepherd. But in all the different reasons, and you can try this game at home, why would somebody steal a sheep? There's never a good reason. Nobody is stealing the sheep to help the sheep. And Jesus was reminding us, Satan is coming. He may have a million motives, but none of them are to help you. But I come that you may have life and have it abundantly. I've realized that when I'm having depressive thoughts, none of them are true. None of them are helpful. And they're all essentially attempts by the thief to steal me away piece by piece. But Jesus wants me to have life and have it abundantly. And I will tell you that I still have a long way to go. It's different now than it was. For example, now I can tell my wife, she'll say, "How are you doing?" I said, "Well, I'm having a tough day." And she said, "Anything wrong?" "No, I'm just having a tough day." Normally before I wouldn't have ever said anything like that. But now I can say I'm having a tough day. I can now start to think, okay, what am I thinking? And work my way through it. I'll admit I've got a long way to go, but thanks to all the help I've gotten, and thanks to realizing that all my years of ignoring help was just a way of letting the thief come and destroy, I'm a whole lot better off than I was. So where do we go from here? There came a point for me that I had to get some help. Now, I know when I speak to groups that 1 in 5 people struggle with depression. Not all as bad as I do, and some worse. But I can tell you something we all have in common. We all struggle with one thing or another. And there comes a time where we have to say, I need help. It's the first thing that lets us then turn and look at Jesus and say, he's coming to help. So it's really that first step towards an abundant life. And so today, if you're sitting here and you're listening to any of this and you're wondering, I wonder how I could get some help. If you're telling yourself, I need help, you're taking a step in the right direction. In a moment when we have our time of invitation, I'll be up here and Ty will be up here. And if you want to just come talk to us, we can talk about that abundant life that Jesus comes to give. And we'd be happy to pray with you regarding that. And then the church as a whole. I told you before, I like to share my story with the hopes that that one, people that need help will get it, and two, that churches will start to get a little better at how we handle these things. It meant a lot to me after 16 years of trying to ignore this as a pastor myself. It meant a lot to me on I think it was the second, maybe the third day I was in the hospital. They came and they told me, they said, "Your pastor is called. He'd like to come see you. Is that okay?" I said, "Sure." And it just so happened that the day he came, it had been a little chilly in the unit, and I had gone to the nurses and said, "Could I get a sweatshirt? Because it's a little chilly." And they had one, but it was like a triple XL. And so, the sleeves hung down and the thing hung down, and they had the size written real big right here. And he and I have laughed about that time and time again. He even suggested I could do that as a book promotion, maybe buy some oversized sweatshirts. And anyway, but it made a world of difference to have my pastor come. And since then, other members of the church come and not judge, and not demand to know what it was I did wrong that would cause me to be depressed, but to simply come and love. We live in a world that is really hurting. I don't think we even have to debate that. We live in a world that can't even understand anymore why it's hurting. And every now and then, church, that world looks to us. Too often they get kicked away. We need to become a church that reflects the Jesus that wants to give life and give it abundantly. And so if you're here today and you're not struggling with this, if you're thinking, well, this is a great story, but it doesn't affect me, that's great. But it affects somebody you know. Somebody you know is getting stolen away piece by piece. And they don't need your lecture. They don't need your judgment. What they need to see is Christ in you that is willing to give life and give it abundant. So I'm going to pray, and then we'll